All right. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Medicaid and long-term care. Medicaid is a joint program between the federal government and state governments. Uh, as a result of the fact that it's a joint program, eligibility will vary between states. So from state to state, the conditions and eligibility will be a little different. Coverage will be different from state to state. So what is covered and what is not depends on your state of residence. Um, and that also means that the eligibility and coverage may be changed by state legislatures from time to time. So that's something to pay attention to with Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is funded partially by states, which can actually, under the law, obtain some of the funding from local governments and also from the federal government. So it is a jointly funded program and is jointly kind of run. Now, because it is a joint program, there are certain mandatory benefits that the federal government stipulates. So some benefits will be stipulated by the federal government, but then some states will actually opt to offer additional or other optional benefits with varying degrees of coverage and different benefit amounts and so forth. And at this point, I should kind of take a moment to define a difference between home health services and home care. So home health services is going to be the term for trained medical care. Home care is going to be personal care by family or caregivers and things like that. Now, with that in mind, if we kind of progress to a facility, nursing homes must be Medicaid certified in order to be eligible for Medicaid payments. Now, that doesn't mean that all long-term care service providers are required to accept Medicaid. In fact, various long-term care service providers are not required to accept Medicaid, and so not all facilities will necessarily accept Medicaid. Now, in order to be eligible for Medicaid, there are some general requirements overall, and then there are some financial requirements that vary by state. And typically, among those financial requirements, they will have basically some kind of income eligibility stipulation there. So typically, income has to be relatively low. Some states have opted to adopt a special income level, kind of group approach. And generally also the level of assets has to be low. So what are considered to be countable assets for Medicaid are often limited to something around $2,000 to $3,000. Now that doesn't mean all assets; it means countable assets. So there are some kinds of assets that may not actually qualify as being fully countable, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes here. One of the things that it gets kind of interesting is if we're looking at a person who has Medicaid or is possibly qualifying for Medicaid, it wouldn't make sense for the government to impoverish that person's spouse in order to make that person eligible for Medicaid, because then that would just create another person who needs more benefits. So basically, one of the things that Medicaid will do is they'll look at a community spouse resource allowance. And that's basically the program is designed to ensure that the spouse that is living in the community, so not in a facility, has adequate resources available. Now, because there are certain asset level requirements, in that the person can't have too many assets, it might occur to people to spend down their assets to then qualify for Medicaid. And certain types of spending of assets to qualify for Medicaid is actually allowed. So certain types are allowed, but it depends on kind of what was done and so forth. Now, there are such things as what are called partnership qualified policies. And those are basically policies that are created specifically kind of in partnership with Medicaid. And the idea is if a person has purchased a policy and obtained coverage, the government kind of wants to incentivize that. And so by having a situation in which people have participated in those kinds of policies, it basically kind of the government sort of creates a situation in which those people may actually be able to keep more assets. And that's sort of the attachment for those kinds of policies, or the attraction for those kinds of policies, that if a person has participated in one of those partnership qualified policies, then they may be able to retain more assets when they get to the Medicaid kind of stage. Now, as it relates to kind of applying for Medicaid and so forth, when a person applies for Medicaid, there's actually a look-back period of 5 years. And that is to combat what are called below-value transfers. And a below-value transfer would be, for instance, if a person owned a home outright and it was worth $200,000, and they gave it to their son or daughter for $10,000 or something. Clearly, the house is worth far more, and it kind of looks like the person was sort of just giving away assets to try to qualify for Medicaid. And obviously Medicaid doesn't like that, because then that means that essentially there were more people wind up on the program with fewer resources and so forth. So if a person is applying for Medicaid, there'll be a look back period of 5 years to evaluate the transfers that have occurred, the assets that were held, to ensure that there weren't any below value transfers. And if there were below value transfers in that 5-year look back period, then there's a penalty period if that's violated. And basically how this would play out would be a person would enter a facility and apply for Medicaid. And then that's going to trigger that look back period of 5 years. Now, during the point in time which the person has entered the facility, they're going to be spending down the assets that they have. And it's going to take a while for Medicaid to decide whether they have qualified or not. If below value transfers occurred during that look back period, then there's going to be a penalty period. So you have essentially the person enters the facility, and then after they enter the facility, then there's going to be another period, which is going to be basically when they're spending down assets. And then if during that look back period, prior to when they entered the facility, there were below value transfers, then there's going to be a penalty period where there's essentially a gap where Medicaid is not going to cover. And basically the person just has to figure out how to cover that. Now, the amount of that penalty period is going to depend upon the amount of the below value transfers. And basically kind of what they're doing is you're spending down assets during this first period, and then this penalty period is designed to basically kind of incentivize the person to, in effect, this is my interpretation here, claw back the resources that were transferred below value. And so the amount of below value assets that were transferred kind of influences this penalty period. So if there were a lot of assets that were transferred below value, kind of what the government's saying is, well, we're going to delay based on those assets you transferred below value. To me, what that's kind of saying is they're kind of saying, go get your assets back and use those to pay for your care. And then after that, the Medicaid coverage would begin. Now, that does bring up some interesting issues if there's a special needs trust involved. So if the person who is potentially needing long-term care has been caring for perhaps an adult child or just a child in general with special needs, assets that have been set aside in a special needs trust to care for that special needs individual generally are not going to kind of pose a problem for qualifying for Medicaid. Now, with a special needs trust, those trusts generally are not going to cover food, shelter, cash, things like that, but they could be used to cover things like maybe therapies or treatments or things like that for the person that has special needs. Also, there are some Medicaid compliant annuities which are available for the spouses in the community. And so if there is a Medicaid compliant annuity that's covering the spouse, then the idea is, that's helping to protect the spouse. The spouse doesn't become destitute because the other spouse is needing long-term care. And so that there are some Medicaid compliant annuity options to help these spouse that's not needing long-term care meet his or her needs. Also, there is the possibility of recovery of Medicaid costs. So it's possible there could be a state recovery of Medicaid costs. And possibly even after the death of a surviving spouse. So let's suppose we had a husband and wife, The husband winds up in a long-term care facility. Medicaid, the person qualifies for Medicaid, and then after a number of years passes away. And then sometime after that, the wife passes away. It's possible that Medicaid could seek to recover some of the costs paid for the husband that received long-term care um, from the estate of or from the estate, and possibly even after the death of the surviving spouse. There could also be property liens in some cases where liens are placed upon the property of the person receiving care. Basically, ultimately, what it boils down to is the federal government and state government in this joint program. They're seeking to get their resources back. And so the idea behind Medicaid is that you're relatively financially destitute, not in a good place financially, and so the government's kind of indicating that if it turns out that you actually had assets and resources, well, that kind of wasn't supposed to be true in order for you to qualify for Medicaid. So the government will generally attempt to try to claw some of that back. Okay. Hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you for watching and have a great day.